So before talking about performance and blockchains, I want to spend a little bit, if you see my affiliation, so indeed I'm new faculty at the Electrical Engineering Department here at the Technion. I am also with the Initiative for Cryptocurrencies and Contracts. I want to say just a couple of words about this. This is relevant both if you're from academia and you're from industry. We are a group of researchers centered at Cornell Tech, but we're also here and at Berkeley and at Urbana-Champaign. The group entirely, the goal is to merge and converge and know each other's work on blockchain. We are, for the past few years, if you look at our track record, we're defining and we're solving the central problems of blockchain, and this is on every layer possible. So really anything blockchain, from network to smart contracts to everything. One of the central goals of the initiative is to collaborate both with industry through partnerships and with the open source community such as Ethereum. We have a bunch of partners from the industry, large and small. I invite you to take a look on our website right after the session. And finally, we have another goal, which is informing the government and regulatory functions of what blockchains are and what is right, what is appropriate for regulating this new world, which is critical in every state, because of the amounts moved in these cryptocurrencies. That was IC3. And now I'm going to talk about fintech blockchains. So, sorry, here. The cryptocurrency vision that started with Bitcoin is to have this currency with no middleman, like a credit card, no capital controls like state money, but also smart contracts that provide you additional capabilities and complete privacy where no one knows what you're doing. So Bitcoin apparently doesn't exactly achieve that. But this is part of the vision, and now there are solutions that do achieve that. And the fintech industry, this long-time industry that is moving money around the globe, they looked at this and they say, what? You're achieving this kind of thing with an unauthenticated open network? That sounds fantastic, incredible, reliable. Let's look at this. And you have this as a very, very partial list of entities, large companies interested in blockchain technology, and they're looking at various use cases and applications, from transactions between banks at a high rate, both of money and of securities, of digital cryptocurrencies and actual state currency. They won't use it for smart contract infrastructure. If you heard what insurance companies are looking to do. They want to do automatic security structuring. Also, completely different things. Looking at supply chains is becoming a central focus. Walmart has recently started getting involved with this in mind. And finally, there's the Internet of Things vision, where you're going to have your power meter at home directly pay to the power company as necessary, or payment between cars, or there's a lot of promise. Now, the blockchain, or the distributed ledger technology, as the fintech industry sometimes call it, is actually comprised of I think of it as four layers. And they are all necessary for what I just said. So at the top you have the clients. These issue the commands, initiate the smart contracts. Below you have the virtual machine that tells you what the state of the system are, who has how much, what's the state of the different contracts. Then there's the consensus layer that is in charge of having everyone agree on the same state. And this is the layer that is in charge of overcoming consensus attacks like the one we've been talking about today. And then at the very bottom, there's the network layer, which is in charge of propagating the messages necessary for the consensus layer to work. And this one is in charge of denial of service, attack robustness, and things like what Aviv described yesterday. So in cryptocurrencies, these are all mixed, right? The consensus layer is being incentivized by money paid to the clients on top, and you can't really do this clean separation. But the financial industry looking at it, the fintech industry, looked at it and said, this part at the top, it looks great. So the smart contracts layer was really appealing for the fintech industry, but when they looked down at what happens with the consensus layer, they said, well, this eventual long time with high probability guarantees, we're moving real money here, this is not for us. Waiting 10 minutes for a block, this is not for us. So eventually they came here because of the blockchain, but then they kind of tend to abandon blockchain, particularly if you look at systems that at companies that went ahead and already have implemented solutions, like Microsoft and IBM. So there's a huge gap here, right? At the one side, you have the blockchain with the probabilistic guarantees, and the fintech wants high requirements. The cryptocurrencies give you fairly low throughput in fintech terms, and a lot of time per confirmation of a transaction. They need it quick. And then there's the resource consumption, right? There's the proof of work that just burns away electricity. And so this tendency is to change from blockchain to not really blockchain. So about the probabilistic guarantees, I think you heard enough. If you just wait sufficiently long, you get perfect guarantees. Not perfect as in with probability 1, but you get as close to 1 as possible that you are not going to have your transaction suddenly disappear. So this should work for any amount. You just might have to wait a little bit longer. I am going to talk now about a little bit about what the blockchain does, and then about these guarantees. So the goal here is to improve performance. This is where we're headed. And with Nakamoto, you get your incentives for generating a block through transaction fees and through minting new coin. This is the top transaction in orange over there. And you're going to get your fair share of the blocks, assuming everybody is below the attack threshold. But you are going to get forks. Right? Blocks are generated, but sometimes forks appear not because of any malicious activity. It's just that you have two miners at different edges of the network. One generated the blue block, and before the green one learned about it, it generated the green block. So by the time they propagated, you suddenly have a fork. And if you have a fork, you don't know what happens, which side the transactions really are. Excuse me. And the solution is eventually one side is going to win, it is going to have the longer chain, and then the other side blocks are going to get pruned. Their transactions are as if they never occurred, never moved. And a minority is sufficiently small, a minority cannot outrun the honest majority. So now let's look, I want to talk about the trade-off of Nakamoto consensus between performance and security. And to reason about that, we had to introduce several metrics that talk about fairness mostly. So the first one is mining power utilization. So this is about how much of the mining power in the system actually helps secure the system. And the more forks we have, the more branches get pruned, the less of the mining power actually helps secure the blockchain. An attacker only has to outrun the central line here, right, the main chain. If he has a chain that is longer than the main chain, then he wins and he can do attacks, double spending attacks. Second one is fairness, which is a bit more tricky, but bear with me. So let's look at miner sizes. Again, this is just a representative snapshot. And these are the miner sizes on the left, and on the right you see the actual blocks they generated. Every color represents a miner. So you see that the blue miner got 2 blocks on the main chain, and the orange miner got 1 on the main chain, 1 off the main chain. So what we're interested in is in fairness. So how much are you getting to put on the main chain, and is it proportional to the effort you're actually putting in? So let's look at the presence in the total tree and just on the main chain. On the left, you see the presence in the complete tree. This is your fair share as we can assess it. So this is the fraction of non-majority blocks. So we're looking at all pools but the largest one in total. It's 80%. And then on the right, we look at the actual presence on the main chain. So the total number of blocks not of the large pool out of all the blocks in the main chain. And they should be the same. But if you have a lot of forks, they tend not to be the same. The largest pool gets better presence than it should without doing anything fancy, just because it's more lucky when there happens to be a race. And this means that there is a tendency in the system towards centralization. Everybody wants to be in the largest mining entity, so we'll get just one. This is terrible. So why did I tell you all this? Because let's look at what happens when we just naively try to improve Nakamoto. So we're taking Nakamoto blocks at the top here, and we're saying, hey, instead of having these blocks generated infrequently, let's generate them frequently. And we're creating smaller blocks in this kind of experiments because we want the bandwidth to be the same. So if Nakamoto has 1 megabyte every 10 minutes, we still have 1 megabyte every 10 minutes, but we actually have a block every 5 seconds with a little small number of transactions. So what happens is, because the blocks come more frequently, but the network latency is still the same, we're going to get more forks, and so worse security, according to our metrics. Here what we try to do is say, okay, latency is latency, let's try to build larger blocks and allow better throughput. So the frequency of the blocks is the same as in Nakamoto, but each one is larger. Now the catch is that larger blocks take longer to propagate. And since they take longer to propagate, you increase your chances of generating a block before hearing of a conflicting block from the other side of the network. And so again, you get more forks and worse security. So we're looking at these metrics on bandwidth is just bandwidth. Latency, I did not get into these metrics, but intuitively it's how long it takes you to place a transaction. And then the security we talked about too. And this is now showing you just the mining power utilization. And we actually ran an experiment. I'll tell you more about the details later, but the x-axis here is the block frequency, and it's log scale. So as you move to the right, you get more blocks per second. And on the y-axis, you see the mining power utilization. We want it to be 1. We want all the blocks to be on the main chain, but we only get a fraction. So usually a lot, but as we generate blocks more frequently, we get more branches, and so less worse mining power utilization. The same happens as you increase the x-axis change here. We increase block size, and you get the same effect. So we have a trade-off. If we want to improve performance by having more frequent blocks or larger blocks, we get worse security. But we know that replicated state machine protocols from the past, they didn't have this trade-off. You were bounded by the performance of the individual server in your system. So if you have 3 servers doing a replication, then you were bounded by roughly speaking, the slowest one, the capacity of one machine. But the protocol didn't introduce its own latency, and here suddenly it's introduced. And what we found is that this is not an inherent limit of the protocol. In a work called Bitcoin NG, next generation. And the idea is the following. Let's look first at Nakamoto. With Nakamoto, you have a block, and then you have transactions coming into the system and arriving at the different miners, and then suddenly one miner generates a block, and that block has all the transactions. We'll draw it like this. So once the block is placed, it determines the order of the transactions that arrived until that point. So there are really epochs to the system. After a block is generated, the epoch starts, and at the end of the epoch is when a new block is generated and serializes, orders the transactions in the system. And what we would have liked to have is a lot of serializations points to get better performance. But then we run into all these issues that we just saw. And so we came to this insight. Really, the block generation does two separate things, which are combined in Bitcoin into one block, but really it's two separate things. It's leader election. It's choosing who gets to serialize the transactions in the epoch, and it's serializing the transactions. And we don't actually have to do them together. So in Bitcoin NG, we do the following. We flip it around. So an epoch starts with leader election, with a proof of work block generated. And then from that point on, the leader gets to serialize the transactions frequently in its period until a new block is found and the epoch ends. And then this new block determines the leader for the next epoch. So it looks like this. We have the rectangular ones are called key blocks, like keyframes in a video. So they don't have any content. They're just about leader election. They contain the entity of the leader. And then after them come micro blocks, the circular ones. They contain only the transactions, and there is no contention there because the leader is already elected. So these can happen frequently. Technically, the key block contains the public key of the leader, and each micro block is signed with the corresponding private key. The key blocks appear at exponential intervals. There are proof of work blocks generated, as you know. The micro blocks have short interval and they're deterministic. So let's say every 10 minutes you have key block on average. Every 10 seconds exactly you get a new micro block. So the leader generates them quickly and publishes them. So this sounds fantastic. It's everything we wanted, but how do we actually incentivize it? We need the participants, the miners, to follow the protocol and do what we want them to do. So in particular, we want the next miner, the next leader, to include all the micro blocks currently placed, currently published. And we want the current leader to place all the transactions it knows about in micro blocks, rather than sit quietly or publish empty micro blocks. So how do we incentivize this? Here's a bad solution. Let's say we give some small weight to the micro blocks. So a chain with micro blocks weighs more than a chain without micro blocks, and so it will win in case of a fork. And then the leader gets the fees for the transaction it places in the micro blocks, and so it is happy. Why is this broken? Because selfish mining. So let's say the leader tries to create a secret chain, as you see here at the top. So it has it generates the first, its first block and publishes it, and it also publishes 2 micro blocks. But then it keeps 2 additional micro blocks secret and try to mines on top there. At this point, it's supposed to be at the race condition if the honest parties do find the block. But with this incentive mechanism, once the honest parties publish their key block, the attacker can publish the 2 micro blocks, and since they count towards the longest chain calculation, the attacker will always win. So we're making sure selfish mining works at every attacker size. This is terrible. So here's what we actually do. The chain selection rule is the heaviest chain, the longest chain, but we only count key blocks. We only count blocks that carry proof of work. Micro blocks don't count at all. But the fees from micro blocks are not given to the leader that places them, but they are distributed. 60% go actually to the next miner, and only 40% go back. There is a little bit of a wiggle room here, but it's about 60-40. If you change it too much, then it either stops being beneficial to place transactions, you're better off making sure you're after them, or it's not beneficial to follow microblocks, you're better off just cutting off earlier. So then we went ahead and we built this. We ran this at the Cornell basement where they have hundreds of servers. Yeah.
When a new microblock appears,
Yeah.
it could be that some civilizations have not progressed throughout the blockchain.
Sorry, when a new microblock appears?
It could be that some of the transactions have not progressed on the blockchain. So there is a split with one side containing civilization tokens and one containing blockchain.
There's just one chain.
Yeah, but the old leader publishes serialization tokens every 10 seconds.
The microblocks, yes.
The microblocks
And then a new leader arrives.
But when the new leader arrives, the old leader maybe doesn't know about that.
It takes some, exactly. This is exactly, that's a fantastic point. So this is let me try to repeat the question. When a new leader arrives, when a new leader arrives, the old leader might not have heard about it yet. It's generating microblocks very quickly. So the microblocks might get propagated. Let's say here there are 2 more microblocks or 3 more microblocks before the previous leader even heard about this key block. And this actually is the usual place, the usual situation in our experiments. So the time for you to consider a transaction as accepted is not at the time that you see the microblock, but at the time that you expect to see, according to how long you estimate, it will take you until you see a key block that is generated anywhere on the network. So if you estimate that it's going to take you 20 seconds to hear about a new key block, then you need to wait a function of that time when you want to accept money sent to you in a microblock. Okay, so this happens, and this is acceptable. This is how it should happen. But by the way, this can be done maliciously. And the proof of work mechanism overcomes that. You just need to be comfortable enough, sure enough that you've seen everything that's going to propagate over the network. So we ran 1,000 standard clients. This is a Bitcoin client version, the version of 2 years ago. And we ran Bitcoin NG, which is a patch on top of the Bitcoin client. So there's no abstraction here. We actually ran the standard client on our own local testnet. We actually used 150 machines and ran seven cores on each. The network is 1 gigabit, which is not exactly representative of the internet. And so we emulated its behavior. We used measurements we took in another study. And we implemented this light virtualization of the Linux kernel. And after we implemented all that, we looked at propagation times and how they change with block size, and we saw that the trends are the same trends that Decker and Wattenhofer saw with their famous 2013 measurement work. Now, the mining pool sizes we took again from the Bitcoin statistics. We looked at, so these are publicly available. So we looked at the statistic for a year, and we looked at the average size of the largest pool, second largest, etc. Over time during the year, the largest pool changes, right? But there's always a largest one, second largest, and this is the mining pool sizes that we've used. And then we started running the experiments. So let me show you. First of all, this is the latency, how long it takes you to place a transaction. And we see here, notice that we're increasing block frequency on the x-axis, and we're looking at the consensus delay at the y-axis, which is logarithmic. And low is good, right? We want the blocks to propagate fast. And this is how long it takes for the system to agree on the state of a transaction. And you see that as we increase block frequency, Bitcoin improves. This is why we are increasing block frequency in Bitcoin. We want to improve latency. So indeed it improves, and Bitcoin NG improves even better. And the reason is that the contention in Bitcoin leads to the fact that you will have to wait longer until you're sure that a transaction is placed. With Bitcoin NG, you have less of these, and so you can decide earlier. Now, fairness, you've seen this. Fairness drops as block frequency increases, but for NG it remains at about 1.
Is that micro-block frequency?
For Bitcoin, it's the block. For Bitcoin NG, it's the micro-block frequency, and the key blocks are kept at a fairly high rate. Sorry, a fairly low rate. And then mining power utilization, again, stays at the top for NG. Now we're increasing block size. We want to increase the bandwidth of the system. And again, you see that Bitcoin NG just stays straight up. Security is not affected. But there are two new security concerns. First of all, users can technically override the fee distribution mechanism, right? They can go ahead and pay miners not with the payment mechanism. But our point here is that this mechanism is for the users. This is how to motivate miners to place their transactions in microblocks and then keep the transactions in the microblocks. So they can do this, but they'll only harm themselves. More serious is the sitting duck issue. If an attacker can find who the miner is in Bitcoin, it's too late. The miner has already placed the transactions and they're part of the blockchain now. In Bitcoin NG, once you become leader, then you get the mandate to actually place transactions, and this gives the attacker time to find you and do a denial of service attack or anything else. The answer is that only the actual key is the leadership. So if one wants to implement this, then they better perform the mining in one place, but have a replicated, secure infrastructure of servers that are able to generate the microblocks even if one of them is attacked. And so the attacker isn't that comfortable just finding one machine and killing it. So a bunch of related work. You'll hear a lot of this later on. There's the line of work from Aviv's group on block DAGs, replacing the single chain with a DAG. We believe that in some situations it might be combined with Bitcoin NG, and you will enjoy the benefits of both approaches. There are classical solutions for doing rapid consensus, but they are reliant on permissioned settings, etc., and they're not open. They're difficult with churn. Then there are payment channels. We've talked about yesterday. It's a different model. They achieve a different thing. It's not a replacement. For example, if payment channels become popular, you're going to still need a lot of room on the blockchain for settlement transactions, so there's always going to be the issue of the blockchain performance. And finally, there are other works that use the same concept of using the proof of work, not just to generate a block, but as a sort of a leader election or a token for participating in a leader election process. And again, there's much to do this. This is sort of an academic joke, so we're not done with figuring out performance, but let's talk about the waste issue for 10 minutes. So you all know the story of how the mining operations of blockchain becomes worse and worse, and all the money being spent on cooling, and this is sometimes called proof of waste. So the proof of work in the block proves real-world waste, which means you spend some money on buying the hardware and on running it. The attacker must also spend similar resources. So this is fantastic. This really gives you security. So arguably this is not even waste because it secures the system. But the work that is done for it is done for nothing else but this. And there are environment-friendly alternatives. So again, centralized solutions. There is the idea of proof of stake that typically relies on an altruistic majority and often takes longer to converge. It's getting there, but the assumptions are sometimes different, typically different. Then there's the idea of doing useful work, and useful with quotation marks. This is something like proving that we've stored some information or that we've found sets of prime numbers. First of all, the examples that exist are, it's an open question. You can argue on whether they're useful or not. And even if they are useful, so if you find some work that is useful and you can use it for proof of work, it has the appropriate properties, then it's probably more useful for some than for others. Which means only those that find it more useful are going to actually do the mining, and so it's a centralization issue. So what I want to talk today is in a model that we call partially decentralized. So mostly everything is as decentralized as you know from cryptocurrency blockchains, but we are going to trust a trusted secure hardware manufacturer, Intel in our case, to generate trusted execution environments. What are trusted execution environments? Well, here. And I'm talking specifically about Intel's SGX. Excuse me if you were also here yesterday and you hear this again, but I want to have everybody on the same page. So this is a guarantee from your CPU that it is running your piece of code correctly. This is called an enclave, what is run inside the secure environment. You get confidentiality. The user that runs the code on the CPU cannot see what the CPU is doing. This includes a random number generator inside the CPU. And I was cut off because of the microphone, I think. Okay, so 15 minutes. So even the user can't see what random numbers were chosen. And then integrity is also guaranteed. The user cannot affect what happened inside the CPU. It cannot affect the contents with or without knowing what they are. And finally, it can provide remote attestation. So we're not trusting the application code, the operating system, anything apart from our enclave, the specific thing that we're interested in running. Not even the hardware. So everything that goes to memory is encrypted. Only the CPU can see what's happening, and the CPU we're trusting because we're trusting Intel. And then Alice can send this attestation to Bob that contains a fingerprint of the code she was running. So the CPU is saying this is the code that was running. The output, whatever it was, whatever the program chose to send as output, and then a signature from Intel saying this was correctly run with all these guarantees on a CPU that I vouch for. And when Bob sees this, he can verify that this is real.
What code do you trust?
This is something that you have to check. So if I send you an attestation on a piece of code, you're only going to be interested if you trust the code that you know I was running. Does this make sense?
So when you say that you don't trust the application code, you're saying that somehow that trusted code comes into the CPU, runs there, and the CPU attests that that's what it ran.
Yes.
So originally somewhere you trusted it, whoever provided it.
Whoever provided, yes, but not anything else that was running on the machine. That's what I meant. Okay. So this is the goal of this. This is what we wanted to show here. So you trust only the processor and the piece of code that we're interested in. So what Intel provided using these insights is, in this model that we called partially decentralized, is that let's simulate proof of work by sleeping. So instead of working, let's just tell the CPU to sleep for a random period of time. And the first one to wake up is the first one who found the hash, if you want to find the parallel. And then this CPU gets to generate the block. So you get proof of work like guarantees, not like proof of stake or anything like that, but it's energy waste free. You're not wasting energy. However, our analysis shows that you run into a different issue, which we call the stale chips problem. Old chips and new chips, old CPUs and new CPUs, are worth the same because their clock ticks at the same time. So waiting with an old CPU and waiting with a new CPU costs the same, which means that miners are better off by buying a lot of old CPUs that are cheap to buy because they're not useful for anything anymore, and putting them in farms, and then instead of spending the money on capital, they're spending the instead of spending the money on power, running mining hardware, they're going to spend the money on buying a lot of old CPUs and placing them somewhere and running them on low energy until they find a block. So we still get waste. Additionally, there is the broken chips problem. It is widely believed that it is possible to break individual SGX CPUs, individual instances. It was not yet publicly done, but it should be possible. So whoever does that can then sign as the CPU anything. So tell the other side it is running the enclave, but really do something else. And so cheat and cheat and generate blocks at a higher rate than it actually should. And Intel proposed a simple statistical test that works to some extent, but we have a different one, and we can argue about its efficiency. So our idea is we're going to do proof of useful work, but it's actually going to be useful work. And I should say at this point, this is not for running Ethereum 3.0 or Bitcoin or anything like that. This is not for a libertarian cryptocurrency that trusts no one. This is for contexts where you do trust Intel, but you want each party to be able to mine by itself. And the idea is that we're going to have everybody do their own useful work, whatever they're doing. So Amazon is running other people's services, you're running your local machine learning algorithms, someone is doing protein folding, looking for a cure for disease, do whatever you like. We're going to count your work, the work you're doing for yourself, towards blockchain mining. Two of the many points of proof of work. One is that all data must be on the blockchain because we later need to verify. So you can't convince me by providing 3 gigabytes of output from your machine learning algorithm that indeed you did the work. I need something succinct that I can place on the blockchain, and anyone can later check to verify that you did the work. And the verification has to be quick for performance reasons. So this is how it basically works. You have the enclave, and the enclave, you give it the useful work that you want to do, protein folding, and then the block header that you want to mine. And it's going to run the useful work and send you outputs occasionally for the useful work. But then it also counts the instructions you're running as you're running. Every CPU instruction, it counts. And it simulates the n instructions you've been running as n Bernoulli tests, as if one of them was hashing and checking for the difficulty with Bitcoin. And then if you win, the enclave outputs proof of useful work. So if you win, you get a block. So you do your usual work, you get your usual outputs, and you also do some accounting, and if you win, you might get a block. And note that you can't do this concurrently for multiple branches of a blockchain. So you choose one branch, just as you did with proof of work. It's very similar to proof of work. So we're running only predefined programs, right? We need, recall that we need to verify, I mean, the attestation is going to show us that we did the work. And so each enclave, each type of useful work has its own fingerprint. So if we need to store all the different fingerprints, I mean, who decides what fingerprints are sufficient, are appropriate for this? So the fingerprints has to be for an enclave that does the accounting correctly and reports the instruction counting correctly. So we need someone who is going to vouch for every one of these and add these to the hard-coded code of the blockchain. This would be terrible. Whoever has this job basically controls the chain. Not acceptable. So instead, we introduced something we call hierarchical attestation. So we have a single enclave that is hard-coded into the client, which is the compliance checker. It checks that an enclave is compliant, that it does the accounting correctly. And the compliance checker outputs the fingerprint of the enclave that should be able to run, along with the fingerprint of the compliance checker to prove that the compliance checker was running, and the signature from Intel. So now the proof of work is two attestations, one for actually running and counting the work, and one for proving that this work is indeed an okay proof of work. So we implemented this. You can now provide any C++ code that is SGX compilable. We're automatically placing the instructions into your code, and there is some linkage to do. And then you get this proof of useful work enclave object. Up. Sorry. Yeah. And then you run it, you get your useful work. You once run it against the compliance checker and get the proof of compliance. And the proof of useful work, you run iteratively until you find the useful work and you publish it to the blockchain. I'm going to skip this graphic in the interest of time, and I'll tell you about some measurements. You see that our overhead is currently between 5 and 15%, depending on the properties of the code, how many jumps you have inside. And I'm just going to tell you two things about our statistical tests against broken chips. So we're looking at an attacker, 40% of the mining power, that is trying to overtake, generate as many blocks as it can, but the statistical test stops it. And we see that with time it is able to generate more blocks than if it behaved honestly, but the rate of blocks, because the statistical test becomes more accurate with more samples, the advantage actually drops to 0.01%. And the waste, so the work, the legitimate proof of work we've rejected because of the statistical test, and we shouldn't have, but it's statistical, so sometimes it's wrong. This also drops, so we get more and more blocks that are rejected, but with time the statistical tests become accurate, and we're done. So I'd like to thank my co-author on this, Bitcoin NG, and on REM, Resource Efficient Mining, and the Proof of Useful Work, which was just published in Usenix Security. And this, I hope, gives you some hope that actual blockchains are going to be useful in the fintech industry. These are just some examples bridging the gap, and you've seen more and you'll see more today. And yeah, a bit closer. Thank you.